Hi class, welcome to chapter 4, processed costing. So this chapter is going to be a little bit of a different focus than chapters 2 and 3. Because chapters 2 and 3, those two chapters built on one another because they were referring to the same kind of costing system. Chapter 1 kind of laid the foundation for most everything that we'll be talking about in this class. But what you'll see from now moving forward is we're going to, each chapter for the most part is going to be looking at different topics. So this is a little bit different from Accounting 2, where we kind of started with the accounting cycle and each chapter built and built and built on that entire cycle. Here, chapter 4 is a completely different costing system, for example, than job order costing. So depending on what kind of business you are, you will elect to use whatever costing system fits your situation best. So with process costing, it has some similarities, but there's also a lot of differences when we compare that to job order costing. With process costing, what makes it different is the fact that process costing is used when there are few products being made, few products being produced on a continual basis or a continuing basis. So rather constantly on a continuing basis for a long period of time. Okay, so the key there is few amount of products being produced on a continuing basis for a long period of time. So think of maybe a pencil manufacturer or anything that is homogeneous and produced in large batches on a continual basis. Job order costing, though, and I'll just shorten that as JOC. Job order costing, on the other hand, that system is used when many different jobs with different production requirements are being worked on each period. With different production requirements worked on each period. So remember, with a job, each job was unique or is unique. In job order costing, we accumulate costs per job based on the costs that are needed to produce the specific units to their specifications for that particular job. Process costing, on the other hand, we don't accumulate these costs per job because we are making a bunch of the same products at the same time. So for this reason, with process costing, this kind of system accumulates costs by processing department. Accumulates costs by processing department. Where we said with job order costing, costs are accumulated by each job. And one more difference is that with process costing, this system computes unit costs. I'm going to take that back. Unit costs by department. Okay, unit costs are calculated by department on production reports. Where with job order costing, this kind of system computes costs by job. Okay? Computes costs by job. And with that one, we use a job order cost sheet. So those are some of the main differences between the two kinds of costing systems. There are some similarities, however, between the two costing systems. So let's look at some of their similarities. All right, so both of these systems, okay, both of them assign material, labor, and overhead cost to products. That they share. Also, both of them use the same general accounts. So both use the same manufacturing accounts. And this would be like your manufacturing overhead, your raw materials, your work in process, and your finished goods. Those they have in common. And also, for both, the flow of costs between those accounts or through those accounts, basically the same. I'll be looking at some of those entries here in a couple of moments. Okay, so some of those foundational things are remaining the same. Okay, the same kind of inventory accounts are being used. The flow between those and through those accounts is very similar, and we still assign material, labor, and overhead cost to products. So those fundamental items are still staying the same. But we're talking about process costing. We said we are accumulating costs by processing department. But what is a processing department? We kind of want to know what that is if we want to understand process costing. So essentially, a processing department is any location where materials, labor, and overhead are added to a product. So you might have a fabrication department, an assembly department, a painting department. Each department is going to be doing specific tasks. So the assembly department, for example, will be different than the painting department, for an example. So each of those processing departments add its own materials, labor, and overhead to complete those tasks necessary for the phase of the manufacturing process that that department is responsible for. And when that department is done, it moves and shifts those units to the next department so that department can go ahead and do its job further. With a process costing system, there could be 2 processing departments, 4, 3, doesn't matter. It will all depend on what kind of product it is, obviously, and how many phases that product needs to go through to get to completion. Okay, so it's important to note, though, that the activities performed within a processing department, they are performed and should be performed uniformly on all units. So that means the work that you do on the units that come in the morning should be the same work that you're doing on the units that come through in the afternoon and the evenings. Okay, so for that reason, the output produced of a specific processing department must be homogeneous. So that means the units that a department completes work on, those units that it completes work on today should be identical or homogeneous to those units completed tomorrow, last month, a month from now, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's one big distinction. With process costing, we're talking about homogeneous products being produced, like we said, for example, pencils, or anything that is produced in large batches, like even plastic bottles, for example. So with process costing, each processing department should be producing homogeneous units. That's different from job order costing, remember, because each job was producing something different than the next job. It had its own specifications. So think of custom-made jets. We'd use process costing to make custom-made jets because, job order costing to make custom-made jets because each jet is going to have its own specifications, its own specific jobs that go into making that one jet. So we would use job order costing in that example instead, where that wouldn't work with process costing, because if you're making custom jets, each jet is not going to be the same and it's not going to be costing the same. So that's the main distinction there. So now, let's assume you have processing department A and then processing department B. Once department A does all the work it needs to, after it adds all the materials, labor, and overhead to get the units complete with respect to the activities in that department, those costs will be moved and shifted to department B. And then department B can go ahead and add its own materials, labor, and overhead to get that job, to get that batch complete. Okay? Now, let's assume department B is our last department. After department B completes its work and all those units are now nice, finished, and ready to be sold, those units will be then moved, their costs will be moved to finished goods. Okay, so that is reminiscent of job order costing as well. So, to summarize here, with job order costing, costs are traced and applied to individual jobs, and traced for those direct costs and applied for that manufacturing overhead. So costs are traced and applied to individual jobs. Okay? But with process costing, costs are traced and applied to processing departments instead. So that's one of the summarized main distinctions between these two costing systems. So let's look at what some of those journal entries might look like within a process costing system. So let's assume we want to record the use, and again, that would refer to the requisition of materials. Record the use of raw materials here. Let's say it's in the amount of, let's say $12,000. Let's assume that, let's say 10,000 is direct materials, and of that 10,000, 2,000 used in processing department A, and 8,000 used in processing department B. And that would mean that the remaining 2,000 refers to indirect materials. So the way we journalize this is going to be almost identical to how we would have journalized this in job order costing, except there are a couple of distinctions here. Instead of having one work in process account, we now have a work in process account for each processing department. So remember, direct materials, whenever you use direct materials in production, the cost of those direct materials need to get dumped into work in process, just like we learned with job order costing. But here, that 10,000 doesn't go into one work in process. Instead, it gets split up between the two processing departments. So first, we will debit work in process, department A. So we'll debit that work in process account for $2,000. Then we will further debit another work in process account, but specifically department B's work in process account, and we'll debit that account for $8,000. And again, keep in mind this $12,000 is an actual amount of materials used, materials requisitioned from the raw materials storeroom. So of that $12,000, we know that $2,000 of it was actually indirect materials. That's a known amount. Remember, it's not estimated, it's known. So if we know we've spent $2,000 on indirect materials, just like in job order costing, indirect materials gets dumped in to manufacturing overhead. So we're further going to debit manufacturing overhead for that actual overhead amount of $2,000. And then overall, we are going to credit raw materials to show that a total of $12,000 worth of raw materials has now been used. So we've broken up that $12,000 into the $2,000 of indirect materials and the $8,000 of direct materials used in processing department B, and $2,000 of direct materials used in processing department A. Okay, so as you can see, the only difference here is we have an additional work in process account added in there. If this was job order costing, we would have put that 8 and the 2 together and dumped the $10,000 into one work in process account. But here we're working with multiple departments. So that's how we would record and journalize the use of raw materials in production amongst the different accounts, including indirect materials as well. So what about labor costs? So let's assume we have $20,000 in labor. Let's assume it's broken down as follows. Let's say $8,000 of that labor refers to direct labor used in Department A. Let's assume that $10,000 of that $20,000 of labor is direct labor that was used in Department B. And then let's assume that remaining $2,000 refers to indirect labor. So remember, labor costs, specifically direct labor costs, just like direct materials, they get dumped in where? They get dumped into work in process. But with process costing, we don't have just one work in process account. We have a work in process account for each department. So the direct labor that we used on Department A would go into the Department A work in process account, where the direct labor used on Department B would go into that department's own work in process account. And again, this is $20,000 of known costs, known labor costs. That means that we know for a fact that we spent $2,000 on indirect labor. That means it's an actual manufacturing overhead cost, so it will be debited to manufacturing overhead as well. Okay, so let's see what that journal entry would look like here. So the very first thing, let's go ahead and debit work in process for Department A. We'll debit that account for $8,000. Further, we will debit work in process for Department B. We'll debit that account for $10,000 here. And then lastly, we'll debit manufacturing overhead for $2,000. That means overall we're going to end up crediting some account for $20,000. If these are labor costs incurred, if it says we didn't pay it yet, we're going to assume that we can go ahead and credit salaries / wages payable for that total amount. So we'll go ahead and credit salaries and wages payable for that entire amount. So that's $20,000. So instead of crediting cash, we credit that payable account. So that's how you would journalize the incurrence of labor costs in a process costing system. Okay? And what about the application of overhead? Because remember, we have to journalize that as well. What about the application of overhead? Well, remember, in a job order costing system, we debited work in process and then credited manufacturing overhead, because the way this account behaves has not changed. The left side is still the actual side and the right side is still the applied side. So none of that's changing. So let's assume that $5,000 of overhead was applied to Department A using a pour, like we should be. And then we assume that $8,000 of overhead was applied to Department B using a POR, whatever POR or PORs this company has decided upon. So remember, whenever you apply overhead, it involves work in process and manufacturing overhead, just like with job order costing. So the first thing we would do here is we would debit work in process for Department A. We would debit that account for the $5,000 of overhead applied to that department. Further, debit work in process for Department B for $8,000. And then we're going to overall go ahead and credit manufacturing overhead for $13,000 for the total between those two. Because remember, whenever you credit that account, that means you are applying overhead. So it's clear to see here that the entries so far don't really look that much different. We just have this extra work in process account kind of thrown into the mix here that we just need to make sure that we're keeping up to date. Okay? Now keep in mind, when goods are finished in one department, their costs are just transferred from the one department to the next. Okay? So we kind of need to know what that entry would look like as well. So let's assume that Department A finished work on units so far costing $12,000. So Department A finished its work. Doesn't mean the units are complete, but Department A finished its work on units costing $12,000. Okay? Units, and then those units were transferred to Department B to finish production. So whenever Department A finishes units, the cost of those units need to be moved from that department onto the next department, which is Department B. So we will simply debit the work in process account for Department B for that $12,000, and we will credit the work in process account for Department A for $12,000 as well. So all that's happening here is you're moving the costs from the first processing department's work in process account to Department B's work in process account. Because now Department B has to finish up those goods. So far it cost Department A $12,000 to complete its work. So now it's just shifting those costs into the next department so that Department B can go ahead and add more costs to those units to get them to completion. So let's assume there's only Department A and Department B. What happens then when Department B, looks like a 13, when Department B completes all of those units? When Department B completes, let's just say units costing a total of $12,000. So let's assume everything that was transferred, and let's make that actually a larger number. We'll make that $20,000. So that would mean that $8,000 of costs were added in within that department. So let's assume that Department B completes units costing $20,000 overall. So that means that $12,000 of that was spent within Department A, and that means that $8,000 of that $20,000 was spent further in Department B to get those units to completion. So what would that look like if I completely finish these units and if they're ready for sale? Well, if they're ready for sale, they need to go into finished goods. So I'm going to debit finished goods for $20,000, and I'm going to credit the work in process account for Department B for $20,000 as well here. So that's the cost of goods manufactured that is being moved from work in process to finished goods there. So as you can see, those cost flows are nearly identical, just with some slight differences there due to this different costing system. So I'm going to pause this video here, and on the next video we will actually jump into equivalent units of production and use of our template coming up.